Today's saint is Padre Pio. Now, Padre Pio is a saint that I first learned about, maybe about 20 years ago when we had a visiting priest come for a parish mission, and he talked about Saint Padre Pio, who I was not familiar with. He was a more recent saint. I believe it was 2002 when he was canonized as a saint, and yet I was not familiar with him. In fact, an interesting fact about him, he dies in the year that I was born, so he is a 20th century saint. Well, the priest talked about him and really got me interested in knowing a little more about Padre Pio, and I've read a couple books since about the extraordinary life of Padre Pio. I guess he just kind of fascinates me with some of the things that he has done and some of the abilities and things that God blessed him with. So Padre Pio, we would say Father Pio in English. Padre is just the Italian word for father. And he was born in 1887 in Petrocina, Italy. And he was named Francesco Frogioni. But he chose the name Padre Pio after Pope Pius I. When he became a priest, he changed his name. His family was poor peasant farmers. They had very, very little money. He had a job. His job was to watch the sheep, and he would pray a lot and felt very close to God already when he was watching these sheep. At like age 5, he already knew he was going to be a priest and had dedicated his life to God. Something else interesting about him is that he could see his guardian angel, and he also had visions of Mary and Jesus speaking to him. And this is all when he was like 5 to 10 years old. He was never a very healthy child, and then at age 10 he had a couple different serious illnesses, and you know how sometimes you can have some lingering effects from illnesses. Well, that was the case with Padre Pio with these. And so he was very weak and not a very strong person, but was he strong in his love of God. He would, even at age 10 and 15, young age, would do sacrifices or penances. And one of those that he would do is he always slept on the hard floor with a rock at the pillow, even though his bed was right next to him. And he would choose to do these things. Did you know in the Catholic Church that on Fridays we should always choose some kind of sacrifice we're going to make? One of those could be like not to eat meat on Friday like we do during Lent, or maybe whatever you do give up during Lent, you do it on all the Fridays of the year. Padre Pio did penances way more often than just Friday. He slept with that rock as his pillow every single day. In 1910, at the age of 23, he was ordained a priest, and he would be a priest for 51 years, I believe it was. He joined this monastery, and that is where he stayed. He didn't travel or take vacations. He just worked as a priest all that time. In fact, his days were 19 hours long. That doesn't leave him very many hours to eat and sleep, does it? Mass was the center of his spiritual life, and people would say his masses could last for hours. And that was because of his reverence. He was consecrating the host and holding the chalice. He would have these long pauses where he would contemplate and think and pray and just ponder this great miracle of the Eucharist, where we actually receive Jesus. We receive his body and blood. Not bread and wine. It's transformed into Jesus's body and blood. And Padre Pio definitely understood this. And while he'd have these long pauses, other people would be drawn into contemplating those, because you'd think, maybe they're going to start complaining that Mass is lasting at least 2 hours. I mean, I know people, if Mass is over an hour long, they think it's too long. But, the opposite effect had happened out of this. More and more people came to his church, and they not only wanted to come to Mass there, but they wanted his counsel, because they could just tell he was so reverent and full of wisdom. Eventually, pilgrims from around the world go there, and that's not uncommon still to this day. I believe there's like 8 million people who visit his monastery in Italy every single year. And the only place that's more greatly visited than Padre Pio's monastery is Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. He was a very humble and prayerful priest. Now at age 30, he received the stigmata, and that's when you get holes through your hands, and sometimes people get them through their feet too. Sometimes, they get one or they get all of them. Padre Pio had them in his hands and feet, and they're pierced all the way through, but there's no way, doctors would inspect these. These were not made by instruments, nobody actually nailed through his hands, yet he had the same imprints of that would bleed, just like Christ had on the cross. Remember, Christ with his hands out had, those great big nails pounded through all four of his limbs. This sometimes happens. It's happened to many saints. St. Francis of Assisi is another one. I think St. Paul had these too, if I remember correctly. And it sometimes happens to people who are very, very close to Jesus, who are really true close friends of Christ. Father Padre Pio was the first priest to receive the stigmata. Confessions was another thing he was very, very well known for. And he could see right into your heart. And if you didn't confess everything, he would remind you or ask you what you were doing at this time in your life, and if there was anything you wanted to confess about that. If you tried to lie to him, like people were testing him to see, he's not going to know I'm not telling the truth, because they'd heard these stories. Well, he would say, no, you are making that up. And, so he knew if you weren't being completely honest in the confessional. And I was thinking, this might scare some people, but instead it's drawn very, very big lines of people to his church. And sometimes you had to wait 2 to 3 weeks to get into confession with Padre Pio, even though he was listening to confessions, something like 4 hours a day or something. So they had to issue tickets. Can you imagine? You got to get a ticket and then come back at the right time so that you could have your confession heard. Another interesting thing about Padre Pio is something called bilocation. Now, bi means two. Location means where you are. So he could be in 2 locations at one time. He never left the monastery, yet there are people who testify. They are positive they have seen him and talked to him, and that he talked back to them. All around the world, cities all over the world, where people claim that they saw Padre Pio. An interesting story is during World War II. This was the city he was in, or the town that this monastery is in, was occupied by the Nazis, and there were American pilots flying over it, and they were bomber planes, and they were trying to drop bombs on this city because of the Nazi occupation, and they couldn't get the bombs to release from their plane. And the pilot looked up out front, and he saw a monk in his brown friar robes, hands out in front of him, and went, oh my goodness, what's happening? Anyway, they never were able to drop the bombs, and many years later, this pilot visited this monastery, and he saw Padre Pio, and he says, oh my goodness, that's the little friar that was in the air in front of my plane. One of the things that Padre Pio is also known for is founding a hospital. This hospital's name is Home for Relief of the Suffering, and it is in San Giovanni Rotunda. That's where this monastery is located, and the hospital is still there today. And as I said, like 8 million people go there on a pilgrimage. I would love to go to San Giovanni Rotunda someday. Now here's a little quote by Padre Pio. He said, pray, hope, and don't worry. Worry is useless. God is merciful, and he will hear your prayer. So let's ask Saint Padre Pio to pray for us.